Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nicole from the Nonprofit Hive, and I'm really glad to be here today. Today's Ask Me Anything, or AMA, is part of our Community First Summer Spring series. And the goal is simple: practical learning, honest questions, and an opportunity to hear from someone who has 25 plus years advising nonprofit organizations on strategy, leadership, and adaptability. A couple quick housekeeping notes before we jump in. So we are hosting this through StreamYard webinar. This session is being recorded, so we will share a replay after. Sorry about that. Please do drop your questions in the chat as we go. You don't need to wait till the end, so you can always pop those questions in there. We will keep an eye on it. And excuse me. And then we will be weaving those questions in during that AMA portion. So we have pulled in a few questions that were submitted during the registration. So thank you everyone who did share some questions in that process. So today's session is called Planning to Plan: Considerations Before Embarking on a Strategic Planning Process with Dr. Rebecca Sutherns from Sage Solutions. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. So before we get started, Rebecca will kick us off with a short learning segment, and then I'll guide a few curated questions, and then we'll open it up to the live questions from the audience. And just a reminder, this is a facilitated community first conversation. So we're here to learn. So please add your questions in the chat. Rebecca, I'm really excited for this one. I think so many of us have gone through the strategic planning process, and just the opportunity to actually hear from your expertise is going to be great. So I just want to share a little background about Rebecca as well. So Dr. Rebecca Sutherns is a high energy, insightful strategist and world-class facilitator who has advised hundreds of nonprofit organizations across Canada and internationally for more than 25 years. A certified professional facilitator, ICF Associate Certified Coach, and professional level adaptable quotient coach, she brings intellect, enthusiasm, and deep expertise in strategy and adaptability to her work as a speaker, writer, and advisor. She is the author of several books, including Sightlines: Strategic Plans That Gather Momentum, Not Dust, which reflects her practical, action-oriented approach to strategy. As the founder and principal of Sage Solutions in Guelph, Ontario, Rebecca designs and leads customized strategic planning processes that help organizations move from complexity to clarity. Known for asking powerful questions and fostering meaningful dialogue, she supports leaders in reimagining their next chapter with confidence and momentum. Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. We have just a few minutes to kick things off and maybe spark some curiosity in folks that are here. And I'd love to hear the questions that people have as a result. So let's just jump right in. I want to talk about why having a strategic plan might be a good idea at all, because it is more than just, ticking a box on a to-do list. But I think one of the big planning to plan first steps has to do with the purpose of it in the first place, beyond just being able to say you have one. So just a few items here that are worth thinking about. One is that I think it can really build enthusiasm for the mission of an organization and for the other kind of core identity statements that an organization embraces. Not so much because we can, recite them off the wall of a cubicle someplace, but more that it gives us a chance to talk about what an organization is for. And so building enthusiasm for that, I think, is a really useful benefit of strategic planning. It also does help you align your decision making and make decisions about how to focus your attention and your resources. And that is beneficial because hopefully lots of people will be in the room with you to hear that happen. And so people can understand together why we are saying yes to certain things and why we are saying no to certain things. And hopefully that would be similar answers across the organization because people were part of the conversations that led to the filter that the strategy is. Along with that, it gives your people an opportunity to see how their work connects with the work of the strategy. And also in strategies that are well mapped out with measurability and performance targets and those kinds of things, it can give you a really good visible and shared understanding of what doing well looks like. Staying on track, good performance, that kind of thing. And so I'm a fan, obviously, of having strategy, but there are reasons why you may or may not want to do it right now. And there's some considerations about how or when to embark on it that I want to just touch on briefly, and then I'm happy to take some questions. So, one of them is the purpose. And I mentioned earlier just now why I think strategy is important, but your organization may or may not see strategy as a useful tool. And I think if you are in a situation where the purpose is simply because you think you're supposed to have one, that's not really a compelling reason to invest the time and money and energy that it's going to take. And so I think there's some groundwork that needs to happen first to help people, including the key leaders in the organization, really think through whether they are in a position to need and use a strategy, and also if they're in a position to invest in its development. And so deeply understanding the why of this beyond a should is a first step that we might want to talk about. Another one has to do with timing. Any organization at any time is somewhere on a strategic planning cycle. They're either developing one or implementing one, or it's expired, or they never had one at all, right? You're sort of somewhere in that. And I think having a sense of where you are, and therefore whether it is time to embark on a new one, is important. But again, I think just because your old one has run out isn't enough. It's probably a necessary but not sufficient condition for planning, because it doesn't necessarily say that you're, excited to do it again. It has that element of, aren't we supposed to do this? And so having a sense of how well did we use our last one? Are we developing some good muscle memory about how to embed our strategy in our decision making? Those kinds of things matter when it comes to timing. A couple of other timing elements. One is to think about what other big things are going on. Partly so that, for example, if you have a budget cycle that would say, hey, we really should get this thing done ahead of budget so that we can allocate those resources in a way that's aligned with the strategy, that would give you a sense of the timing on a calendar, for example, of when to have it, or if you want to incorporate your annual general meeting, when's your AGM. So you're planning it that way. But there's also timing, for example, if you were experiencing a leadership change. I don't normally recommend that a brand new executive director or CEO embark on strategic planning, the first month that they're there. They may want to spend some time listening and settling in, and maybe finishing up some priorities that they inherited before they embark on developing a new roadmap for their own leadership season. And so the timing of some of those elements is worth thinking about. The alignment, the leadership alignment I'm referring to on the slide, really has to do with the level of perceived consensus that you have on your leadership team and board. Because I am a big fan of diverse teams that have really candid and, healthy, debatable kinds of conversations. But if you are in a situation where there are some really big rifts or decisions that need to be made before you can actually move into strategy, it's probably good to get people roughly on the same page before you head into this kind of process. I'll give you an example. I worked with an organization once where they were trying to decide if they would merge two organizations, or if they would actually acquire a third one that would come in with one or both of the other ones. My recommendation to them at that point was not to do strategic planning, even though they had intended to, because we weren't sure, or I wasn't sure, if we were planning for one organization, two, or three in that scenario. And so they had to get that merger piece settled first before they could move into their strategy process. Bit of a specific example, but if you're finding that you have a lack of alignment on prioritization from your board or your senior team, you may want to try and get some of that a little bit settled first. Then there's some consideration about the approach that you want to use. And there's lots of models and opportunities to engage in planning. I think what I'd like to do here is focus on how participatory you want it to be. We'll talk probably later about specific roles, but one of the elements here for me is that a board ultimately is responsible for making sure that an organization has a strategy and is following it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the board has to be involved in developing it. They could choose to delegate that role. And so figuring out if the staff is going to do this, if it's going to be staff and board, if it's going to be just board, if it's going to be external partners and others who have an interest in the work of the organization, who on staff, all that kind of stuff about the kind of, not just the details, because certainly that can come later, but understanding the philosophy that your organization has about the kind of approach that you want. Could also have to do with whether you're going to bring somebody in to help you do this, help you facilitate the process, or whether you're going to do it internally. There's some other kind of just elements to the design of the thing that you might want to think about ahead of starting or engaging the help of a consultant, for example, that kind of thing, which of course has to do with resources and capacity. One of the challenges I find when it comes to strategy is that there are some steps that we need to follow, whether you are a large organization or a small one. And so I would love to be able to shrink or grow the budget, for example, of a project to be proportional to the budget of the client organization, but that's not always easy to do because the steps of a planning process are the same for under-resourced organizations and healthy resource organizations. And so figuring out if you actually have the resources to do this, and that's financially, it's also time, it's energy, it's are you too distracted, are people's calendars too full? Some might say that's exactly when you must do it. You can't afford not to, but if you honestly don't have the capacity to do it, even if you bring in an outsider to help you, which is what I do a lot of the time, I can't give a client organization the best service if they have no time for me. It's not a question of handing the task over to somebody external. It's a question of co-creating a process and a product together. And if you don't have that at a given time, you might be better to wait until you do, or make it a priority to clear the decks a bit so that, say, 6 months from now, you might be more ready for that. And then I think finally, if you know already that there is literally zero commitment to actually implementing or learning how to embed your strategic plan into the execution of your priorities and into the decision making of the organization, I kind of sniff that out really quickly early, because no one wants to be involved in a process that is not meaningful. And I think strategy has an enormous potential to be an excellent filter and alignment tool and an organizational learning opportunity, developing it together. But if the people that are particularly involved in implementing it are very unlikely to actually use it as a tool, I would rather work on that first before developing it, so it doesn't give us kind of grounds for frustration or cynicism later. So these are some of the things that I'm really interested in chatting about, and happy to answer questions about any of these things or other ones as we go along, but hopefully that'll get us started as some variables that you might want to take into consideration. I'm not hearing you, Nicole. I'm seeing your lips move, but I'm not hearing your audio.
My bad. My mic. Thank you. Thank you. That was super helpful. And I was just saying, Tasha and I have, with the Nonprofit Hive, have gone through some strategic planning processes just that we've been doing on our own. And what you've shared is already giving me a really great roadmap to how we can improve our processes. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And I imagine there's a lot of people who can connect with that directly already. So I do want to share a planning to plan tool that Rebecca has also offered. So in the top left corner there, you'll see a QR code. And I would recommend that you take a peek at that. And it's a great tool that you can use as a resource. We'll share it in the email after, but I just want to have that up there as well, that you can reference at any point. So I'm going to pull a few of the questions that came through during the registration process. And because there were some pretty big consistent themes across them, especially around roles, clarity, and tools, I was hoping we can start with that roles question. And I know you touched on this, but I'm wondering if you could dive into it a little more. So before Before an organization begins strategic planning, how should they distinguish between the role of the board and the role of the ED or staff? Do you have like specific examples you could share with
Yeah,
us?
absolutely. Let me start by saying that there are lots of ways to do a good strategic plan. So please understand that what I'm about to say in the next half hour is just my preference based on my experience. I work with about between 40 and 50 organizations a year, and I've developed some, preferences, but that doesn't mean that this is the only good way to do it, right? So my preference is to have board and senior staff involvement for sure, and more extensive involvement than that if it makes sense. So let me unpack that a bit. I mentioned earlier that boards need to make sure that the organization they govern has a strategy and stays aligned with it. They can delegate the development of it. However, I do find it more helpful when you have some board perspectives and some staff perspectives in the room to develop it in a participatory way. People are much more likely to implement decisions, any decisions, if they were part of making them. And
Sure.
so you really want some of the key people that are going to be implementing the strategy to be in the room, and you want your directors to understand the rationale that led to that list of priorities. And so my preference is to have a board and staff combination. More specifically, though, I think the sort of is it your whole board and your whole staff team
Mhm.
or representatives thereof? That can really vary, and it depends a bit on the size. I like to have a tight steering committee and then a group of people involved in strategy development workshops. But those workshops, I've done them with 6 people and I've done them with 30 people. So often it would be delegates or representatives of the board and of the staff. And then other parts of the process would be kind of the next layer out would be even more of the staff would have opportunities to feed in, and maybe the whole board has an opportunity to feed in at points in the process. And so often that's at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. So hey, what are the questions and conversations we should be talking about? That's a bigger group. Maybe this is the draft we're coming up with. How is this landing with you? And
Mhm.
maybe that's an opportunity for wider involvement. And maybe near the end, either to say, here's what we've come up with, what do you think? Or more likely, here's what we've come up with. Can some of the more frontline people or more operational people help us develop the performance targets for this? And once we get into a slightly more, it's still not operational, it's still strategic, but a little more of a day-to-day tactical piece of work that board members probably don't have enough visibility on to actually be able to
Sure.
set the measures. And so there's places where you might have wider participation, but I prefer having a combination of board and staff, and somewhere for most organizations around, this is pretty arbitrary on my part, but somewhere between 10 and 12 people involved, if you're facilitating it skillfully. I think if you are trying to do it internally when there's a lot to juggle and it's something that internal people, they just don't do very often, right? And so in that case, sometimes having a larger group of people is a little more overwhelming, and you may want to keep it tighter. So I think there's lots of ways to do this well, and ways to involve other people too, like your community partners, other people that you collaborate with, perhaps your customers or
Mhm.
clients. That all happens in my world. It happens fairly early in the research phase and information gathering, but it can also happen near the end, or later at least in the process, if you decided to take it back out to a wider group for refinement. That's also a possibility. There's some variability there, but hopefully that gives folks here enough to go on to think about that. And then if you do decide to bring someone in to help you, these would be some of the design conversations that you would have with them, but you'd already given them some thought ahead of time.
That's awesome. I think there's a lot of really great ways that you can bring people in, and I love the idea of bringing your community or your network outside of your board even. I'm sure that sounds overwhelming to some folks, but I love being able to hear like that firsthand kind of perspective and listening to the people that you're serving. I love that approach to it all. So I'm also curious, and it feels like it could be like a beast very it could become a beast very quickly. And strategic planning on the surface can look messy, complex, and even contradictory at points, I'm sure. So help organizations turn all of that into something clear, useful, and actionable?
Um, I'm a facilitator, so this is what I love, but I realize that it's not every love, right? Uh, and I think that one of the key things is what I'm going to call decision rights. I think it needs to be very clear who makes what call, because even if you involve a bunch of people in a series of workshops, you're going to have a whole bunch of ideas of what could go into a plan. And someone along the way needs to be the person, or maybe the smaller group, that actually says, of all these 100 ideas, these are the 6 that are going to land and be part of the plan. And so the first step, I think, is deciding together before you really even start who gets to decide what ends up in the plan. Board usually approves it, but it doesn't mean that the board automatically would be the group that decides what's in the plan. It may be put forward, say, by the ED or the CEO, or you might have that delegated to a very small strategic planning working group or something like that. Sometimes clients would look to the outside consultant if there is one. I would push back on that and say that's not my call. But deciding what goes in is really important. I think another piece is that you make visible the criteria by which you will decide what goes in the plan. So not just whose
Mhm.
job is it, but what makes a good idea good? What are we trying to achieve in this plan? So if we have said, again, early, we want something succinct and impactful and affordable and exciting to work on, then those are the 4 criteria that are going to form the lens through which we see each step all the way along and say, how close are we? How close are we? Are we getting close to this? Are we getting close to that? And it's understanding, again, the purpose of a plan is to help you make decisions. It's a filter. It's not an inventory of all the things an organization does. It's a filter for decision making. So that's one of my criteria that I would suggest is how well does this tool help us make decisions? And if it's not taking us in that direction yet, it's not clear enough. It's not useful enough. So that's another early step. And then a third one, and I'll stop here, is to talk about what you're trying to build together. What are you picturing in your head at the end of the day? Because some people might be picturing a 1-page infographic, and other people might be picturing 14 pages of Excel spreadsheets with really detailed KPIs and dates for every quarter for the next century, right? And so if you and I are both on a team together, but we're watching a different movie in our heads about what a strategy should look like, our ability to turn it into something useful at the end is difficult. So I'll give one other little tip. Actionable made me think, when I write strategies in draft, I pay very close attention to the verbs, because
Okay.
things are actionable based on the actions you describe in the strategy. And so when I talk about accountability or measurability in a strategy, that's not just quantification, it's also you're accountable for the verbs that you write. And so if you say, for example, that you're going to explore something, I'm going to hold that to a different standard than if you said you were going to lead the world in it, like your ambitiousness of your intention is built into your verbs. And so that's one of the little hacks that I use to make sure that the document is useful, is to have the group read through only the verbs and say, are those the appropriate roles and level of ambitiousness for us going forward? Is that what we want to commit to?
I love that, because I find whenever I've been part of these processes, there's often times where people feel they have like there's competing priorities. And I think that also allows you to like hone back into, if you're looking at your mission, what are the verbs to get us back there? So I think that's a really useful tool. I'm curious, thinking about tools. There's a ton on the market now, AI, all the beautiful things that are quickly popping up. And I'm curious, obviously, like the SWATs of the world, and someone actually mentioned Porter's 5 Forces or Blue Ocean. And I'm wondering, how should leaders decide which tools are actually useful for their context and which ones might overcomplicate the process?
Such a good question. Thank you for whoever submitted this one. Um, At the risk of sounding like everything depends on facilitation, I do actually want to start there, because it's often not the tool that's the problem. It's the user of the tool, right? Just like any of us, if we go to a hardware store, it's not the hammer's fault if I'm really terrible at framing, right? And so the tool itself, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It does probably matter, but I think it's the conversations and the clarity that the tool allows you to have in the room together that I'm most interested in, because I think there are lots of tools that we could use, any of which would lead us to a good solid strategy. Certainly I like some more than others, and I wouldn't recommend using several in the same process in case that complicates things, including not just the tool, but also the format. And what I mean by that is we are still, again, negotiating whether we do things digitally or in person or hybrid, like that kind of format of a meeting, and thinking about the project design of this. So, often people will call me and say, we've booked our strategy retreat, we're ready to build our strategy. And I'll say, great, but we can't get a whole strategy written in one day together. We have to think about the pacing of it and the spacing of the sessions and that kind of thing. So sometimes the cadence and the facilitation skill of the process has more impact on the output than any given tool. And so if you're combining digital meetings and hybrid meetings and unplanned hybrid meetings and in-person ones, and then you've got somebody that's like, hey, I heard about this really cool tool and I think this other one's really good and whatever, all of a sudden we can really lose focus. And the way that I would actually choose the tool has to do with alignment with what you need. And so, for example, silly example, but some of your listeners have probably used sticker dots to vote on things before. I've had a client text me ahead of time from before a session and say, we should use sticker dots. Well, we weren't choosing between anything. We were not voting on anything in the meeting. And it was a misalignment between the methodology and the intent of the meeting. And so if your tool that you've heard is great and you had a friend recommend it, if it isn't aligned with what you actually are trying to do, it would have been like me showing up at that meeting and handing out a bunch of sticker dots, but giving people nothing to stick them on, because you shouldn't lead with method. You lead with purpose and choose your method. And to me, the tools are part of a methodology that have to align with the objectives, and the objectives need to be set first.
That makes complete sense. And just like many people in this planning process, like we all learn things differently and see things differently. The example you shared earlier around like the chart versus the 14-page document, I think we all still take in this information differently. So that format is incredibly important, and to consider different people's approaches on how they show up, I guess. So we have a variety of organization sizes on this call and in our community. And I'm curious how many organizations are trying to plan while operating with very limited money, staff, infrastructure. And I'm curious, how can leaders approach strategic planning honestly when resources are tight or funding is uncertain?
And I did mention earlier that I find this a really pragmatic, important question that everyone asks. I mean, even organizations that are big by anyone's standards
Fair.
still don't spend money easily, right? Everyone's paying attention to you want to keep your planning investment proportional to the benefit that you're going to get from it, proportional in time, proportional in money. And yet there are some steps that we need to follow. And if I'm a tiny little organization, I may not have the money, for example, to hire an outside consultant, but the steps that I need to follow in strategy are probably the same steps. You need to gather some information, you need to set some priorities, you need to refine them and figure out how you're going to roll them out. And trying to keep those steps very much proportional to the benefit of having the strategy is important. So for example, if you are really small and you're doing this in-house, it may be that you have an action planning meeting for 2 half days. And maybe that's realistic to what you can do, and you facilitate it internally and you come up with kind of a 2-year action plan of, we're going to focus on these 3 things for the next 24 months. Maybe you don't have the budget at that point to be consulting widely externally, or to be, I don't know, investing in expensive graphic design for the communications pieces that would take this out into the world, or that kind of thing, or using, licensed materials that you have to pay for. So I'm not suggesting that there are no levers that you can pull to keep it modest, but the steps I follow are the same for tiny organizations and big ones. It's just that it may be that the research phase is more modest, or that you do it internally rather than hiring a researcher to do it, or your engagement with your interested people, you rely on a, I don't know, staff engagement survey that you did recently, as opposed to asking people again, or instead of having an in-person retreat at a really lovely venue, you do end up doing the workshops digitally because it's going to be more affordable. So there's ways that you can tweak it, but I would rather make each step modest than skip steps. And I would also rather do modest steps to have something than not do it at all because you can't do it in a big, huge way. I don't think you need to do it in a big, huge way. There's some advantages to spending some money in certain places, and I can certainly talk about that. But I would rather people have these conversations to whatever extent they can. I would also say, don't use up all your energy in the research phase. That sometimes happens, where they want to have this really participatory thing, and all these focus groups and town hall meetings and community gatherings, and they get all this really interesting information. They haven't developed their strategy yet at all, and they are exhausted, and they've spent all of their time and money just on the information gathering. So you want to make sure that you keep it invested in what is like in the full process, rather than burning out too soon. It's like running a bit of a marathon. You don't want to start too fast.
That makes complete sense. And I love that there are still actionable ways that you can do this on your own. And one question I'm just going to pull from the audience that pulls into this. So Laura was curious about ideas for client intake questions for successful strat planning engagements. And I think that feeds into how to do some of this on your own.
Right. I'm assuming from your question, Laura, that this would maybe be client engagement at an early stage in strategy, where you're saying maybe it's things like, where do you think our organization should focus its attention more or less? And sometimes I will draw little dials, like dial up the volume here and dial down the volume here, so that it's not a yes, no, it's a, where do you want to see more attention or less attention, for example. So that would be, or what conversations do you think the people building this strategy most need to have? And that might lead us to say, yeah, there's this thing we haven't been talking about and we need to. Or it might be like, we talk about this all the time and we never land the plane, so let's just land the plane and stop talking about it, right? But you want to ask people questions that they have the answers to. So for example, if it's client intake questions, then you want to ask questions that clients would know the answer to. So you cater your questions to the person you're speaking to. You don't ask them about internal matters that they have no visibility on. And so align your questions to your audience, keep them strategic. And if they are happening early in the planning process, you're asking them questions that are going to help you develop the strategy. Whereas if you were bringing them in later at a refinement phase, your questions might be something more like, here's the draft we've developed. These are the 4 criteria that we wanted it to be clear and actionable, and how close are we, right? So the questions you're asking vary depending on when in the process you're bringing them in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's such a tricky line, I think, when to bring people in. So I'm curious, just out of my perspective, like when would you recommend bringing in some of your clients at the early stages, or does that get too messy and more of that refinement stage? When would you do that?
I've done both, and like
Okay.
either or both or neither. So I
Okay.
don't think there's one right way. One thing I would notice is that clients, depending on the nature of the organization, clients don't have as much visibility on the trade-offs that you're needing to make internally as you think they do, nor do they care about you as much as you think they do. So asking them questions they know how to answer about their lived experience of being a client of yours, and then you connecting the dots between that and strategy is probably more helpful than saying, so what do you think we should put in our strategic plan?
Mhm.
I've had some clients answer like, oh, I come to you for swimming lessons and I'd really prefer that the 6-year-olds be on Thursday rather than Wednesday. And you're like, that's really not going to find our way into the strategy, but that's what matters to that person. And so you want to make sure that in an effort to be inclusive and participatory, you're not generating information that at a strategic level you just can't really use. And I don't say that to be at all disrespectful to clients' experience. I just want to make sure that we are drawing on that experience effectively and not inviting them to give input on something they have literally given no thought to at all.
That's completely fair. I'm going to pull in a question that we got at the beginning of the session, and that's around, it's from Francisco, and they're curious about common mistakes you've seen and what are some of the tips and tricks that can really positively affect the actionable and useful pieces of the strategy and ways that they actually do get used and not just sit on that shelf.
Yeah. There are lots of things that can undermine a strategy's ability to get used. One is that you've used so much time and energy developing the thing that people are completely sick of it by the time it comes to implementation and they don't even want to look at it anymore. So if the development of it goes poorly or slowly or both, the likelihood of implementation is lower. So you want to make sure that the development process builds enthusiasm for this and doesn't deplete everybody's energy for it. I think another way is that people get afraid of measurement in strategies. I like measurement in strategies because that makes something actionable and useful, and you know when you're done. You know if you've done a good job. And without that, if you just say, um, increase partnerships, it's like increase what kind of partnerships, by how much or how many. And you can literally have, as I did once, as an ED come back after year one, report back to the board and say, well, I've developed these 2 amazing, deep, great partnerships. And half the board went, yep, great. We said that we would increase partnerships and you did that. And the other half the board was like, 2? You did 2? Huh. I was thinking more than that. And they were quite unhappy with the ambitiousness or magnitude of the plan. So developing a process by which you can actually develop a similar view around the whole table of what done looks like and what good looks like actually really helps. And something very tactical is if we are embarking on a process together, I will be mapping out for my client organization how much time is required by whom and getting things on their calendar early. And
Mhm.
so rather than saying like, let's wait and see how things go, let's see who's available by then, let's wait and see if we want it in person or digital. I'm not sure how long this is going to take, maybe 3 months, maybe 6. All of those things are going to leak focus and leak energy. And I would rather be able to say right up front, hey, if you're playing this role in the process, it's going to take you this many hours. It's going to be in this format on these
Fair.
dates. Are you in or not? And therefore, the mistake then is on a project management level more than on the strategy level. And I think one more thing I would say is that sometimes people say everyone needs to see themselves in a strategy. My response to that would be a strategy is not a laundry list of every role, every task in an organization. It is leaders' job to translate strategic priorities, which are few, and help their people see their piece of that. That's a communication task. It's a leadership task. It's not the job of the strategy to be
Mhm.
an obvious, visible touch point with every human that works for an organization. Because if you do that, your strategy becomes an inventory of all the things. It's like your menu of services. And I don't think your strategy should be your menu of services. I think it should be a series of choices that help you make another series of choices later about where to put your attention and about what kind of impact you want to have in the world.
Those are super helpful. And I think there is a lot of project management in this process, and it's managing the people involved and communicating appropriately. So I think you've highlighted those really brilliantly. So someone else is asking here, and it's a bit long here. They provided a specific example, but it's around board members and aligning them all on the same page. So they've captured data and have done community service, but they're struggling to get clear directions. Do you have any tips on how to move beyond that dynamic?
It's not easy. Um, I am increasingly including governance training as part of my strategy packages, because what that does is it gives me a couple of hours with the board at the beginning of a strategy process to help them come to a shared understanding of what their role is, what strategy is for, what we're trying to do here. So front end prevention can
Mhm.
really, once you're in this situation, that wasn't a helpful answer. So I will say more. But if you can do more at the beginning, some things at the beginning to get everybody on the same page around what the board's job is going to be in this process, that's going to help. And also what makes for good strategy, what criteria are going to be used, how we're going to link in that data. So we're not just adding to the pile of information, but we're helping them connect dots between that information and the strategy, and then eventually into the operationalizing of it. I think that makes a big difference. And then the other thing I would say is that, and this is not amazing, but I think sometimes outside people can get away with saying things to board members that inside people can't. And so I have clients all the time that have been, saying the same thing and just not landing. And I can walk in, and it has nothing to do with me personally, but because I have some expertise in this and I'm brought in from the outside, the board can listen differently. So that is sometimes a bit of a lever that we can pull. And then finally, back to what I said before about whose call is this? Because sometimes people say this is a board call, and it is a board call to approve a strategy. But if no board members have been involved at any point in crafting the thing, and they don't understand the day-to-day trade-offs that the organization is making operationally, your board members may or may not be well positioned to be the authors of the strategy. And this is where the relationship between the ED and the board chair become really important, because board members are accountable in some way to the board chair and in other ways to your members of the organization. And so you're trying to balance that multiple accountability.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think board members can be tricky at the best of times. And the reality is that they tend to listen to a consultant is a very frustrating truth. I've heard it across the board many times. So thank you for saying it. But it can be challenging for folks in-house. And yeah, I think what you've provided is great suggestions and input. I also in the chat put Rebecca's website where you can learn more. And then again, that QR code in the top left corner, please do check that out. It's a great resource for anyone who's in the throes of this process. So Rebecca, I want to thank you again. It was absolutely wonderful having you join us for one of our AMAs. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us live and shared questions before the session. You've really helped make this session and help shape it. And then please do we'll share the resources, the article and the recording with you after, so you can review it. And if today sparked any ideas for you, or you'd like to join any upcoming Nonprofit Hive events, please be sure to check out our Luma calendar. Rebecca, thank you so much. Your brilliance is so helpful to this community, and I just appreciate everything that you shared.
Thanks for the opportunity, Nicole, and thanks to everyone for listening in.